Welcome to the fourth panel of E Pluribus Unum's Truth, Action, and Reconciliation Conversation Series. At this beginning, I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege, since as we speak, John Robert Lewis, the great congressman and civil rights hero, is being mourned and is in the midst of his going home ceremony. We mourn his death and we celebrate his life. President Obama just finished his eulogy, and he quoted scripture from James 1, where he said, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." And of course, as President Obama spoke of John Lewis's life, he talked about the joy that he exhibited throughout his life, but most importantly, the perseverance of calling us all to do good work, to do hard work, to get in good trouble, to make sure that we attain what we all hope to be, that more perfect union one day. So in the spirit of John Lewis's life, we dedicate this talk that we're going to have today with the fantastic people that are going to join us. I'm so grateful that all of you have chosen to spend the next hour with us. To move towards what we're talking about, reconstructing our narrative, we have to tell the true story of our country's role in creating inequitable systems. Our topic this week will be economic equity. Throughout our nation's history, Black Americans have been denied opportunities to build generational wealth and participate fully in the great bounty that our country offers. And they also bear the brunt of the financial burdens in difficult times, like we're seeing as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we will explore the systems and pivotal points in our history that have purposefully kept so many Americans disenfranchised. I am honored to introduce our panel today. Dr. Andre Perry is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings Institute and the author of the new book, Know Your Price. DANYELLE Solomon is the Vice President of Race and Ethnicity Policy at the Center for American Progress and also served as Policy Counsel at the Brennan Institute for Justice. NATHANIEL Smith is the founder and Chief Equity Officer at the Partnership for Southern Equity in Atlanta. Moderating today's panel is the fantastic Angela Glover Blackwell, who is the founder in residence at PolicyLink, an organization she founded in 1999. Angela also serves on EPU's National Advisory Council. Angela, thank you so much. And now I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mitch. And I am so excited about this series. So pleased also that we are going to be talking about the economic disparities in this nation. It's one of the things that I don't think is well understood. And I am so certain that 2020 is going to be the year of truth telling. And the truth of the matter is that started in 2019. The 1619 Project at the New York Times was a classic example, but so much began last year to begin to finally tell the truth about race in America. And here we are focused on an issue that actually colors everything. Why it is that we have this continuing racial wealth gap in America, and it's impacting Black Americans so profoundly. As we think about this, I want to turn first to Andre, because as we reflect on the nation's history, it's clear that the racial disparities and inequities that exist in the economic system are not well understood, and yet they persist. And they persist in the wealthiest nation in the world. And it doesn't matter whether we're in good times or bad times in terms of the economy of the United States, we continue to see this lagging gap. Some say that the wealth gap is even growing. As you think about history, what are some of the pivotal historic actions and decisions that have contributed to this reality, Andre?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for moderating the panel and Mitch for inviting me, and I wish well for EPU and its endeavors. I mean, there's been this long-standing white supremacist myth that states that the conditions of Black cities and neighborhoods are a direct result of the people in them. But we know that there's been policies and practices that have throttled Black wealth creation and community development. And it has been that intentional devaluation of Black lives that has really created the kind of wealth disparities that exist today. You probably know, many people know, that the wealth disparity, the Black-white wealth gap is about 170,000 for white families to about 17,000 for Black families. And we know that a lot of that occurred because the federally backed Homeowners Loan Corporation redlined districts prohibiting the letting out of low interest loans, refinancing loans, home loans, to families that enabled white families to move to and to start new neighborhoods. More importantly, it enabled families to pass on wealth through the equity in their homes to their children and to their children. And Blacks were prohibited from that. And so we shouldn't be surprised by this wealth gap, because wealth begets wealth. And when you don't have wealth, you're more likely to be in debt. And so even in our efforts to get out of debt by getting more education, for instance, we take out more loans and put us in a more precarious spot. Now, again, the issue here is not about Black people's behavior. The narrative around what's wrong, what's perceived to be wrong with Black people have won over the day in terms of explaining the wealth gap. It's always about Blacks don't go to school enough, we don't save enough, that we're not thrifty enough. But the reality is that policy privileged whiteness in ways that enable white people to develop wealth, and it, at the same time, it excluded Black people from establishing wealth.
And when we think historically, I bet you could go back way before redlining.
Oh, yeah.
What about 400 years of not getting paid for your labor?
Oh, yeah. Let me just be clear.
Expectation.
That's right. I gotta say slavery.
Okay.
It's a good place to start.
That the slavery robbed people of to generate wealth. In fact, we were owned. We were the assets. The trading of Black people actually established many of the mortgage systems we have today. So it certainly goes before the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but slavery, it can't be overstated that it really robbed us of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when the founders were saying that this is what we are building the country for. And clearly the 1619 Project put that into view. But slavery, and I'm a proponent of reparations. I believe that you can essentially do a lot in terms of ending structural racism. You still need some type of stimulus package. And anyone who's been through this COVID epidemic knows that some type of stimulus is needed, but try being socially distanced for 300, 400 years, then you really understand that a stimulus package is needed to deal with slavery, Jim Crow racism, and other forms of historic discrimination.
Thank you, Andre. And we will get a chance to come back and talk about reparations and some of those things. But Nate, I want to turn to you, because so often when we tell the story of what has happened to Black people in America, it leaves out the story of our agency, our resistance, our trying to be able to change things through our own efforts. You want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, even from the perspective of economic development and the history of chattel slavery and Africans becoming a commodity for economic development in this nation, even through that moment, and even as we continue to sojourn towards liberation, there has always been a constant fight for our humanity, right? A constant fight for us to push America to actually live up to its ideals of being a place of opportunity and inclusion. And even when America refused to act as if they were committed to those particular policies, the Constitution, it was people of African descent and also communities of color that served on so many occasions as not only the moral compass of America, but also the advancer really of the sojourn that we've tried to realize a more perfect union. I mean, if we sit back and look at incredible leaders, me coming from the South, of course, like Fannie Lou Hamer, or individuals like Ella Baker, or even, God bless him in his transition today, John Lewis, you know, these were individuals that would not give up. And we can go again all the way back to slavery, to people like Denmark Vesey or individuals like Nat Turner, who gave their lives to ensure that we as Black people in particular, but also communities of color. We can also talk about people like Sitting Bull. So, you know, resistance, in my opinion, is American as apple pie. And if we're going to have a serious conversation about economic development and talk about the way that white supremacy has tried to work to devalue us and exploit us, we also have to make sure that people understand that people just didn't allow that to happen, that there was a 24/7, 365 proposition of resistance that was always on the table, and we constantly did that throughout this process and throughout the work of creating a more perfect union.
Absolutely. Resistance and initiative taking. I mentioned again the Great Migration. People often talk about it in terms of moving to the North and the West, seeking opportunity, but people were also leaving brutality. It was a push and a pull. People were taking the initiative after having tried to really make something in the South after slavery was ended and experiencing so much violence, and then moving to places where they thought there would be opportunity and experience both physical violence and many other kinds of violence as well. Danielle, what's so interesting about the data is that from 1968 to 2020, we've hardly seen any change in terms of the gap. And in some ways, it may have even grown. And that's after the Fair Housing Act.
Right.
Andre referred to the way most people build wealth in this country is through the equity that they build in their homes. Even after we were supposed to have more fair and just access to housing, the wealth gap continued. What are some of the things that you think have caused it to persist, even in the face of public policy designed to address it?
Well, when I talk about the wealth gap, I talk about it in the way of looking at all of the collective harms African Americans have had to face over 400 years, compounding over time. So as Andre said, it's not about individual actions or one individual policy that has caused this racial wealth gap. It's all of them working together collectively and compounding over time. Again, wealth does beget wealth, and white Americans have had a huge start in building that wealth. And they built it on the backs of Native American people by taking their land and taking their lives, as well as on the backs of Black people through chattel slavery. Slavery is the first institutional economic system that we had in America. Upwards of $14 trillion were made of free labor off of Black people in America. That wealth was inherited by white Americans across the country. That is an amount of wealth that you cannot just replace with one individual policy or one check. It's all about a complete structural reform. I think it's also important to, when we're talking about the racial wealth gap, to understand that public policy has made this wealth gap further entrenched in what we see today, right? So it's not just about New Deal policies like redlining, it's also about the GI Bill. It's also about the highway interstate laws. It's also about occupational segregation, what jobs are available to Black people. The jobs that Black people hold today, they are overrepresented in service sector jobs. There's a reason why Black people are overrepresented in those service sector jobs. They're overrepresented, it's because those were the jobs that were available to them during Jim Crow, and they were the jobs that they held as slaves. And so all of this is very much connected. And you mentioned the 1619 Project did an excellent job of trying to connect all of these dots for the American public to see that we didn't just end up here. The wealth gap didn't just show up here. It's all intentional and designed this way, and the system is actually working exactly the way that it was intended to. It is not meant to allow Black people to build wealth. And you see that in the data. So when you look at the data, even when Black people are doing everything right? They're following the rules. They buy a home, they go to college, they get married, they do all the things, they still are not able to produce wealth at the same rate as their white counterparts. Today, a typical white family who's non-college educated, a non-college educated white household likely has more wealth than a college educated Black household. That right there shows you that is not the result of like poor choices. That is the result of systems and how systems are putting out different outputs for people of color, particularly Black people. And I think if we want to talk about how to change or build wealth for Black people, we actually need to talk about how we change the system. So it allows Black people to build wealth. I agree with Andre. It can't just be about the systematic change. It also has to be about how do we provide an asset, a real asset, to replace the harm of 400 plus years that is showing up today in real time in the racial wealth gap.
So Danielle, I want to offer you an opportunity to dig just a little deeper into what you were saying. You mentioned how a Black college graduate does not have as much wealth as a white high school graduate. Now, I imagine a lot of people who are white might say, I didn't inherit a lot of money. I've worked hard for everything I have. Why are you making this kind of comparison? It might be good to peel back some of the things that white people might not be thinking about when they think about their current circumstance.
That's a great question. So I think folks always think about inheritance as a big check that their, family leaves them, but it comes in lots of different ways, right? It comes from paying for you to go to school. It comes from paying for your first down payment on a house. It allows you to not take on credit or debt, right? It also comes through, it does also come through family inheritance. So you might get a house from your father or your grandfather, but it also comes in lots of other ways that you don't necessarily see. Paying for your wedding, for example, all things that don't allow you to accumulate debt, which means you have more opportunity to build assets. It also allows you to get more assets. So if you have a little bit of, as Derek Hamilton says, seed capital to play in the economic sphere, you can actually figure out how to make more money, to create more assets. But for Black people in particular, we don't have the opportunity to have any of that seed capital to do that. We are less likely to have resources ourselves or in our family to pull from to produce those things. So for example, we talked a little bit about COVID, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more. COVID-19 is a perfect example of how all of these systems that have never worked for Black people are being showcased, but it's also exacerbating those things, right? We're less likely to have resources to respond to this unexpected emergency. We're less likely to be able to keep our small business doors open because we're less likely to have capital or have family that we can call to say, hey, I need $400 or $500. And so while white Americans may think they don't have a lot of wealth, they are more likely to have assets that provide them with wealth. So they're more likely to have a home. They are more likely, and by having a home, I mean around 41 to 42% of African Americans own a home compared to 73% of white Americans. They are less likely to play in the stock market as white Americans. They also are more likely when they take on debt, their debt is more expensive, right? So even when they are able to get a credit card or able to get a loan, that debt that they take on is much more expensive than their white counterparts.
Thank you. And Andre, people often want to make this about race or poverty. What is the intersection of race, poverty, and education? What's that intersection got to do with the racial wealth gap? On mute.
Yeah, it's not by coincidence that Black people are more likely to be poor, because Black people are devalued and the places where we are concentrated are devalued. There's a lot of talk because of President Trump had sent out a tweet of rescinding an executive order that tried to ensure inclusion in neighborhoods. And he used the racist trope of we won't allow poor people in your neighborhood, or that same type of signaling that says when Black people come, they will reduce your housing prices and so forth. But we've built entire neighborhoods and communities, and cities have been constructed around avoiding Black people and isolating us in specific areas. So not only were we individuals not enabled to develop wealth, entire communities were not enabled to develop wealth. So if you grew up in a Black neighborhood, you're less likely to own a home, less likely to get the kind of school supports you need, because we've essentially gerrymandered school districts around our this risk of Black people, risk assessment of Black people. And so this is not just about an individual sort of reducing individuals' chances at attaining wealth, we've stripped entire communities, Black communities, of being able to develop wealth. So that's why at a scale, we're more likely to be poor because racism is built in most economic growth models. And so it pays to be racist if you're white. It also hurts you if you're Black in that growth model. And so as the economy soars, and you hear people talking about full employment, but when you look at the community level, at the city level, Blacks are still in a recession, and we just sidestep. Blacks are the sacrificial lamb of the full economy in that regard. We just ignore the conditions, the economic conditions of Black communities. But because our systems can move in spite of the state of Black communities and people. So I think that's the intersection. Our structures limit individuals and communities.
We've had a good discussion so far, Nathaniel, where we really have brought in systems and structures and policies that were actually designed to produce exactly what they produce for Black and brown people in this country. The first time there was any systematic acknowledgement that we needed to do something was the promise of 40 acres and a mule. Well, that never happened, but that was a good idea. Too bad. And there were so many moments in history where if we had done something slightly different, we would have had a different result. What do you think about this question of reparations and how to systematically begin to right the wrong?
Well, I think it's a timely conversation, and I think it is a critical conversation because the majority of our communities are being left behind because of the history of structural racism. And if we don't solve the moral crisis that we're facing in America as it relates to structural racism, we will never be able to fully grow economically as a nation and as a region. They are connected. Our moral future and our economic future are connected. And if people don't find a way to solve that problem, it will be a major issue. You know, this question about 40 acres and a mule, especially as a person from the South, is a very near and dear question. And when people ask me that question, I say one of the main issues that stopped us from having an opportunity to get 40 acres and a mule is that we are the mule, right? We are the mule for this nation. We have been the mule, the economic mule that has driven this economy. And so they are not going to give a mule to a mule. Right? We have to begin the process of thinking through how can we begin to create a transformative economy where all people are looked at as an asset and no one is looked at as a liability. And until we understand that, until we begin the process of thinking through that within the context of reparations, it's going to be critical. It's going to be difficult for us to do that. You know, another thing that I have to say, and I think it's really important to say this, there will never be, you know, even though I believe in reparations and I believe that has to be translated with some sort of financial recompense, there is not enough money in America's coffer to pay African Americans or people of African descent for the atrocities that we've experienced in this nation. There is no number that can pay or wash away the sin of slavery. But with that being said, it's never too late to start. And I think that it's very critical for us to begin the process of thinking through that, of thinking of ways that we can begin to utilize the resources of our country to begin to minimize and begin to close the gap between whites and communities of color as it relates to wealth generation and the opportunity to live a better life. I think there are also other aspects that go beyond resources in that way, whether it be around education, whether it be around equitable growth and development, whatever it is. I think it's going to be important that, number one, we think of a more holistic approach and also honor the fact that this conversation around reparations just didn't happen yesterday. There have been people that have spent 30 and 40 years pushing for this conversation. And I believe that they also should be positioned to be involved in this conversation as well.
Thank you, Danielle.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I think first and foremost, we have to ensure that the American government actually apologizes for the institution of slavery, and that hasn't happened. So that's one. I think two, when we're talking about reparations, it's not one or the other. It's both, right? So last year, the Center for American Progress actually modeled the racial wealth gap and tried to figure out if we put forward 5 big economic policy proposals, what would the impact be on the racial wealth gap? We modeled baby bonds, a national savings plan, if we could fully enforce the Fair Housing Act, if we could have a national savings plan, if we could have a robust CFPB to get after predatory lenders, what would happen to the gap? We were able to shrink the gap by 42% in one generation. That's nothing to bulk at, but when you actually look at the interactive, what you see is we still weren't able to bring up Black wealth to where white wealth started 40 years earlier. And what that does is visually show you how big and deep this racial wealth gap is, and it's very much rooted in slavery and the institution of slavery and the wealth that was, you know, built off of the backs of Black people. And reparations has to be part of that discussion, and it has to be a big amount of money that we're talking about, to Nathaniel's point. It's not, you know, $100,000. It's a big amount of cash that needs to be discussed. But on top of that, it also has to be about what structural changes can be made to the American system to ensure that moving forward, we are producing equitable outcomes for Black people. So it's about forward-looking policies, but it's also about atoning for the original sin, and that requires a real conversation about an asset transfer.
You know, can I add to that? Just very briefly. You know, and I go back and forth on this because I say that reparations is owed whether or not it closes the wealth gap or not. It's also a moral issue. Yes. You know, anyone, and I alluded to this earlier, that all of us understand that just from this this pandemic, this current pandemic, that when we were without work for 3 weeks, you had people demanding relief and stimulus. And again, try being socially distanced for hundreds of years, generations. Then you can see the need for stimulus and relief. But regardless of this closes the wealth gap, this is what we're owed. This is what we deserve. And it's important to point out, we have delivered reparations for several groups. So Native Americans received a reparation, Japanese for their immoral internment received reparations to a certain degree. And I'm the first person to say that the amounts were not enough. And I mean, as early as a few years ago, 9/11 victims received reparations. And so we know how to do that if we value people. The problem here is there's not a valuing of Black lives. And so we always find a reason not to invest in Black lives. So the question of reparations, we can do it and we can come up with an amount. And it can help with the wealth gap, but we should do it because it's owed and it's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Andre. And Danielle, I wanted to return to you because this conversation about reparations often is focused on government and government's responsibility and government's role. The movement for Black lives, the cry for Black Lives Matter has really awakened every corner of America to an awareness and a comfort level in exploring what's happened to Black people and how has it shaped the nation and what can we do about it. I had an op-ed in the New York Times just a few weeks ago with Michael McAfee at PolicyLink talking about banks and the fact that banks were underwriters of slavery and even repossessed human beings as a result when loans defaulted. And so when we think about the role of the private sector, it's a conversation that we haven't talked about much, but the private sector has really been complicit in what has happened to Black people over the years. And while we have corporations stepping up and CEOs declaring that Black Lives Matter and talking about diversifying boardrooms and hiring and promoting, is that sufficient? What ought we be thinking about in this nation to really do something about real economic growth, gain, and transformation?
So short answer is no, it is not sufficient. We need more than solidarity statements and press releases. We actually need policy change, concrete policy change at the state level and federal level, but also companies should be making policy changes. You know, I think Andre mentioned early on, and a lot of his work has been focused on home ownership. That's it. That's a huge piece of how Americans build wealth in this country. And banks, real estate agents, the real estate industry, builders have all made money, right, off of stripping wealth out of Black communities. We saw it with the building of Central Park in New York, Olympic Park in Atlanta, the violence that was besieged on Tulsa, the Interstate Highway Act. So these were laws. And I really want to just pinpoint that policy and laws allowed this to happen in Black communities, the stripping of wealth. People knew this was happening and allowed it to happen and perpetuate. Redlining is probably the most famous. Most people understand what that is. But I did actually write down 2 facts I wanted to share with the audience. So between 1934 and 1962, $120 billion in FHA loans went out to families. 2% of that money went to non-white families, only 2%. 74% of the areas that were deemed hazardous or in redlined areas in the 30s remain today low to moderate income, and 60% are predominantly made up of communities of color. So policy and what we do at the state, local, and federal level, as well as what companies are doing around stripping wealth, not only had an impact then, but it has an impact today. And so I think we need to move beyond solidarity statements and press releases and actually sit down and figure out what structural policy needs to change, because we have centuries of harm that need to be reckoned with.
Nathaniel?
So at the end of the day, too, I mean, it doesn't have to be too complicated. I mean, corporations can just pay all their employees a livable wage. Right? I mean, that's a good place to start. I think another good place to start, and we've learned this through the leadership of Maynard Jackson in the 70s, is the leverage and utilization of procurement and contracting as a way to generate the support of small businesses that are owned by Black people and communities of color. If a huge corporation just hired, you know, a Black company to provide paper clips and paper products, I mean, those are millions and millions of dollars that could be utilized to employ new employees of color, as well as support businesses. So it doesn't necessarily have to be complicated in order for us to move forward. And I would say that it's important for us to not allow corporations to use this as a marketing moment and not a meaning moment. Right? We have to begin to be sophisticated enough and understand that we cannot allow this to become about marketing, that we have to move beyond corporate social responsibility towards this confirmation around systemic transformations that need to happen inside of corporations as well as through public policy. And let's be clear, you know, the sister talked at the end about how redlining and other things affected the communities of color and Black folks. Policy can be used as leverages for violence, right? You know, redlining is a form of violence against Black people, right? Highway systems being built on top of Black communities is a form of violence against Black people. The cultivation and development of food deserts in communities and the trauma that Black children face outside of schools where we expect for them to go in and still be in a position to learn and be whole children as they are educated, that is a form of violence. So again, we have to begin to think about this, and I really appreciate the early comments, that this is a moral impasse that we are in America. And as we try our best to begin to fight against that, we have to truly understand what we're up against, and even more so begin to call to question why people are so excited about supporting this effort now. You know, why is it so easy to get rid of Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's, but at the same time, some of our corporations are still supporting PACs and institutions like ALEC that continue to push towards policies that hurt our communities. I mean, we can't allow the private sector to have it both ways. And I think that we have to begin the process of really pushing towards a transformative policy agenda that speaks to all of that.
Thank you so much. Andre, did I see you wanting to weigh in on that question?
No, the one thing I just wanted to really highlight, and by the way, I'm just sitting here listening to Nathaniel, Daniel, this drop knowledge. I'm getting so encouraged. But Nathaniel and Danielle mentioned this. There's more a company can do internally than putting up even we hear the $100 million fund set up, which is good, but let's be clear. If a company did an audit of all the people that they have on their rolls that are working poor and elevated them to a living wage, that would probably do more in terms of making sure this we're changing culture than in a way than giving $100 million fund. And so what I appreciate in this moment, because of what you asked about this Black Lives Matter moment, there's one issue that I think is so important, and it's the defund the police movement. Now, people may not agree with it, but it is a statement that's saying, where are you going to put your priorities in terms of your city budget? And it's clear in policing, you are literally arresting economic development, whereas with investments in police. But if you invest in, say, a teacher, for instance, a Black woman teacher, you're not only heightening the Black middle class, you're honoring that growth, the professional growth of Black women, but you're promoting and amplifying the development of human capital in someone else. We needed to fund the police in other areas, in banking, in housing, and we need to force ourselves to create priorities in ways that really advances wealth and economic mobility among Black families.
Thank you, Andre. And you all have stepped right up to my next question, which I'm going to you, Nathaniel, about, and that is this extraordinary moment that we're in. I have been doing this work of social change for more than 40 years. And I tell you, I'm excited about what I see. I grew up in the civil rights movement. I came out of college into the Black Power movement. I've been involved in social change all my life. And to see the demonstrations that have taken place in this country over the past few weeks, the largest demonstrations and marches that the nation has ever seen, and it was worldwide, it impressed me so much to see how many young white people were not just out there, but they were willing to be in the front of the line when they realized that danger might be awaiting them. It feels different. The conversations that we're having feel different this time. I want to just take a moment and ask you, what role do you think white people are playing in getting us to what could be a tipping point, if perhaps?
I mean, I mean, I believe that it's definitely possible, and I think that it'll be young whites who lead the way. I think that we're dealing with an emerging generation that is finally beginning to understand that white privilege is a burden too heavy for them to bear. That this idea that they are benefiting when at the same time they are suffering in many ways because of the unjust systems that have been baked into our economy and other key modes of opportunity for people who live in America is evil, it is unjust, and even more so, they're being affected by it as well. I think that is where the opportunity is, in addition to all of the other things that have come about, like the COVID-19 situation, 1619 Project. I think all of these things have kind of come together to create this perfect, what I call a movement moment that can be leveraged in order to move the work forward. You know, but I also think that it's going to be very important for us to learn from the past and from our ancestors and from our past experiences. You know, James Baldwin used to say that history, that history is the present, right? That is why I think this conversation is so important, because we've got to be students of our resistance if we are going to use this as a movement moment. And we're going to have to not only march, not only have press conferences, but we're also going to have to take the time to be very clear about what is our policy agenda. What is our reform agenda as it relates to economic inclusion? We also, yes, have to talk about reparations, but we also have to talk about reconciliation, right? And that is one of the things that I think that we don't talk a lot about within the context of our liberation, that we've got to stop the car and encourage people to say, America or whoever else played a role in the challenges that we're facing, that we're acknowledging this, and we are giving you an opportunity to receive our willingness to acknowledge it, and to also say that we apologize in addition to the work that we're doing around reparations. And I think that that's the real challenge, that we're not creating that space, in my opinion, for reconciliation to occur. And what happens is when you don't provide incorporate reconciliation into the work, then what happens is what we saw in the past with the 50-year strategy that the other segments of the community used in the South to turn the white community away from a place of inclusion. You have people who don't feel as if they are connected to the people that have been oppressed, and look at them as, again, a constant enemy and not a part of humanity. And so that there are many, many parts of this discussion that are required. But to answer your question, Angela, I do believe that this is a very special moment. And to be honest with you, from the bottom of my heart, I don't believe that if we don't get it right this time, because there's so many things that came together to create this moment, I'm not sure whether we'll have this opportunity again, no matter how optimistic I am right now.
Thank you. Danielle or Andre, did either of you want to add to that? If not, I have another question. Danielle.
Oh, sure. So I would just say, I look at this moment as like an awakening. I do see this new opportunity for learning, right? And I think 1619 really started to like till that ground, where the American public realized, oh, I don't actually know all of American history. What else do I need to understand? Oh, it's not just about having racist actions. It's about how structures actually work and produce different outcomes. And there is this new yearning for understanding like what actually did happen. And I think, to Nathaniel's point, we need to cultivate that, so it's not just a moment, but a movement, because he's right. This is a very unique moment where we have a pandemic, we have our economy crashing, and we have people's attention now. And so we have to cultivate it and use it to ensure we can keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add that history has shown that protests are needed all the way through policy making. Like sometimes we talk about protests happening before, then we need to somehow transition to policy making. No, history has shown that protests continue as the policy work is being done, and sometimes that the resistance and the policy work is one and the same. So the only thing I would add is that we need to keep the protests going up until the changes in housing policy, education policy, building more transparency for business, looking at wealth transfer. We need we have an opportunity, because we have this election, we should hold Biden to the fire, making sure that he's going to deliver an agenda that is befitting for the moment. But we cannot take this moment for granted. We have to continue putting pressure on local, state, and national leaders to provide the kind of change we want.
Thank you. So I want to see if we can answer this last question pretty quickly, because I have a couple of questions from the audience I want to get to. But we've talked a lot about truth, and we've talked about truth in the context of our economy. Can you think of 3 truths you want the listeners to be able to acknowledge that would help us to begin to have a platform that we can stand on in terms of common knowledge about the wealth gap, Black people, the economy, as we think about moving forward? What are 3 truths? I'll start with you, Danielle.
3 truths. One, I think it's important for folks to know that America's wealth, our economic system, was built on exploitation and murder. 2, the system, our economic system, is working exactly the way it was designed to. This is us. This is how it's supposed to work. And if we want to change it, we have to change it. The 3rd would be racism has always been a factor in policy making. And for us to structurally change it, we have to put forward race-conscious policy. Like, we cannot run away from that.
Thank you. Andre?
Yeah, my first truth that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. The second truth is the assets that we have are more likely more valuable than they are priced. Meaning that we're not broken, our homes are not broken. but we are devalued. And if we get to the policy, we can, then things will be better for Black folk. And then I guess the third thing is we are not going to educate our way to closing the wealth gap. That's probably one of the most enduring myths, that if you keep going to college, you learn more, that you'll close the wealth gap, when in fact, white people didn't get wealth because they were more financially literate or they were more educated. They got wealthier because of policy. And so those are my three.
Nathaniel.
So the first thing that I would say is, in honor of Dr. King, that we do live in a network of mutuality bound by a single garment of destiny, right? That we cannot continue to move forward and think that we're going to build a strong economy and at the same time leave so many of us behind. I mean, it's just not realistic, and it's not possible. I think the second thing is that there will have to come a time where we create the space for reconciliation, that we've got to force that in order to move forward, people have to own and atone for what they've done to people. These are not just spreadsheets or numbers on a piece of paper. These are real people that have been hurt. And so we have to create that space. And, you know, going back to my hero again, James Baldwin, that there will be fire next time. That if we don't find a way to close this gap and don't create the spaces for communities to have hope in their communities for a better tomorrow, what we're seeing right now in terms of the uprisings is nothing compared to what we may experience if we don't get it right this time.
Thank you all. Extraordinary conversation. I could just keep going, and the audience wants to jump in too. One question, which I think, Nathaniel, might be for you, is what lessons can we learn about how energy and electricity are generated in the South that perpetuate the barriers and burdens and abilities to build wealth that we've been talking about here?
Well, I think that answer boils down to the challenges that we face in America around extreme extraction, right? And greed, and the same culture of greed and extreme extraction that led to the enslavement of Africans in 1619 is the same amount of greed and extraction that continues to force us to want to use fossil fuels as a way to drive our energy systems. I mean, it's connected. And unfortunately, where the energy is being pulled and the fossil fuels are being refined are surrounded by majority communities of color and Black communities. I mean, those communities are suffering in many ways. And because of the amount of political power that these energy providers have, the lack of political power that marginalized communities have, they are continuously given an opportunity to really control the politics around energy production and distribution. And because of that, you have people in communities, unfortunately, and in the South in particular, that have to make a decision between buying their, paying their utility bills and buying food because of the utility costs in the South, the energy burden issues in community. So again, the production and distribution of energy, whether it be by the way of our old means through fossil fuels, or whether it be through the clean energy economy, provides an opportunity for us to realize a new economy that is sensitive to the issues of structural racism. But in order to do that, we have to own that and also have to understand how energy is produced and distributed.
Nathaniel, are you aware of any campaigns or activities or initiatives in the South that are seeking to address some of the challenges that you have just described?
Now, I didn't pay you to say that, Angela. I just want to make sure people know that. I don't have anything to do with you asking that question. So actually, a lot of the work of the Partnership for Southern Equity is focused on energy equity and climate justice, but with a racial equity lens. And so we're organizing groups from around the South around a group called the Advancing Equity and Opportunity Collaborative to engage in issues like rural electric co-op organizing. We also have a major national campaign that we're helping to lead around utility shutoffs, because right now around the country, because of COVID-19, the utilities now locally are beginning to push for local jurisdictions to allow for shutoffs. And of course, we all know that that will disproportionately affect African-American communities if the utility is allowed to shut off the energy. So we're trying to build the new voices of Black people who are able to engage in this issue, and even more so beginning to use political power as a way to influence decision-making around energy, energy production and distribution. So yes, there are a lot of great organizations that are out there doing the work. I just provided a quick commercial about PSC, but we have great partners that are helping us to move that work forward.
I thank you for that. And I just love the way the effort to focus on liberation has become so creative in terms of the targets, understanding about energy companies. I have a podcast called Radical Imagination, and one that's coming up is looking at the patent process and how it keeps drug prices high. And it's just people are just all over the issues in a new kind of way. I wanted to ask about Black businesses, though, because we talked a lot about how home ownership builds wealth. And we know that having a good job that pays well over time can afford you the opportunity for savings that can build wealth. Lots of things build wealth. But Black business, I think the two ways that the middle class has been made in America is through home ownership and business development. And businesses, Black people are 3 times as likely as people who are white to start a business. And yet they struggle so to try to get the financing, get the networking that they need. Anybody want to tackle that question from the audience? I know it sounded like my question, but that was an audience question.
Well, I'll just add that we mentioned that most people start their businesses using the equity in their homes to do so. And because we have less equity in our homes, we have less resources to start businesses. A lot of people know me from my housing work, and what I found that after you control for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, homes in Black neighborhoods are undervalued by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's about $156 billion in lost equity. That $156 billion is the same amount of what equates to about more than 4 million businesses based on the average amount Blacks use to start up companies. In addition, when banks do let out loans to Black people, about half the rate of our white peers, we get loans at higher interest rates. And all this was revealed in the CARES Act and the PPP loan fiasco, and a lot of people pointed to this. 95% of Black businesses, when that was implemented, did not receive the PPP loan, largely because we know banking is a relationship-driven entity, and the relationships between mainstream banks and Black businesses business owners is horrible. And so when the federal government decided to go through that same structure, using those same structural elements, you got the result, you exacerbated the problem. And so we need a revamping of the MBDA, Minority Business Development Agency. We should see more money infused in that agency because it's proximate to business owners. We should see more resources and development of Black financial institutions. Now, I say all that, that's not going to close a wealth gap. But I do say that we still have to invest in institutions that are proximate and have good relationships with us. And so we need to find resources for those financial institutions, for those business owners. We had to cut checks if we want to see business grow in Black communities.
Anybody else want to add?
Well, I just think it's important to understand, and again, if we use this history as the present, I know we had talked previously about horrible incidences like Tulsa, Rosewood, also in Georgia and Forsyth County. You know, it's not like Black people aren't successful at business. It's just that when we become successful, people come and try to kill us and stop us from being economically independent. You know, so, you know, violence has been used as an economic development tool for white people in America, you know, aggression and violence. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge the trauma, right? That because of all of those occurrences, the trauma that Black people have kept inside of them around this history of violence as it relates to entrepreneurship. And so again, if we're not doing trauma-informed work around economic development, trauma-informed work about small business creation, then we're going to continue to have this challenge. It's not just about providing capital, right? It's also about acknowledging that some of the greatest entrepreneurs in the history of America have been Black people, right? But every time we get to the top of the mountain, either the rules are changed or we're murdered or pushed off of our land. And so that is a history that we have to acknowledge, and a trauma we have to acknowledge as well that's attached to that.
You know, yes, go ahead, Danielle.
Oh, no, I was going to say it's hard for me to follow those two comments. Those are exactly right. The one thing I would add is Black women are the fastest growing small business owners in America today. And so we have to also ensure that the policy is directed towards them and what they need as well. So but I support everything else that they also say.
And one more thing is, this is near to my house. We actually scrape data from businesses all across the country, my colleagues and I at Brookings and Gallup. And what we found that businesses in Black communities owned by people of color actually score higher on Yelp. You know, and I bring this up, our elders, if you lived in a Black neighborhood, you would always hear elders say, our ice is just as cold. And some would say in some places they say our water is just as wet. You know, because they knew if you bypass quality, you distort the market in a neighborhood in a way where you depress economic mobility. So quality businesses in Black communities are simply not getting love because of the perception of it being in a Black community. And so we have quality businesses. So when we hear about all these programs about we need to learn how to budget better, that's nonsense. We know how to establish businesses. What is missing is investment. That's what's missing. It's not about we don't know anything. Again, there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. We just need the investment, cut the check.
I thank you, Mitch, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with Andre and Danielle and Nathaniel about this important issue. I love that we can call 2020 the year of the truth about race, and we have certainly brought some forward today. Mitch, I return it to you with my gratitude.
Angela, thank you so much. Since I'm in New Orleans, I could say true that. Andre, I understand that. So thank y'all so much. Y'all did such an unbelievable job today honoring John Lewis's memory and what he's asked us to do about getting in good trouble. So Angela, Andre, Danielle, and Nathaniel, thank you for a great discussion. You put a lot on our mind and you gave us a lot to do. And for those who are our guests today, join us next Thursday for the 4th conversation in EPU's Truth Series, when we'll take a deep look at American democracy. Thank you again for being with us today. God bless you all and God bless America.